it right, a joyful ability to actually realize the story that everyone ultimately desires to be in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so then you said something that I thought was, I was thinking about this because you used the word deep cut, and I'm not sure it's always the case, but I would say oftentimes it is the case that there's actually, when we're appealing, so let's make it a sphere. We actually tend to migrate for whatever reason, by the way, to the most superficial world. You think about like just when you're driving,
Yep.
the more
Yep.
you drive a route, the more you're not in the moment of the driving, but in increasingly you're just like listening to music or thinking about whatever's going on. And then a car pulls out like in front of you and all of that collapses. And then you're in the reality of the fact that you're driving a 4,000 pound vehicles, 70 miles an hour. Like the reality of the heaviness of, oh, wow.
But a key moment for me came in finding the work of Michael Polanyi.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And as I read his work, I said, oh, I said, this is making sense of my faith. And not only my faith, it's making sense of everything. Because it's like it's a big trump card. It's like this, you can't help it. This is how you go about knowing. And he was writing as a premier scientific discoverer. And I was the one who was a skeptic. And so in particular, the thing that just I still get chills as I think of it was his frequent aside that says, oh, by the way, here's how you know you've made contact with reality, which is what I was longing for. And what he said is, you know, you've made contact with reality when you have this unspecifiable sense of indeterminate future prospects. Well, who even talks like that? There is nobody in the world that even raises the question. Well, there's one now. I'm a fangirl of DC Schindler, but who talks about contact with reality. But but to talk about indeterminate future prospects, actually Rowan Williams does this too in his book Faith and Art, which I've tapped deeply in the artistry book. But that sense of possibilities, and you may have realized already, or if not, as you get to know me, you'll be sure of this. I'm a very excitable person.
That's good.
And I managed to write a dissertation in writing on contact with reality on excitement because as an epistemic signifier, that you're getting onto something, reality's about to break in, or has broken in and caught you up in this exuberant party. That's my idea of philosophy right there.
Well, I don't think this is different from, I mean, we started talking about snobbery and status, and one of my favorite little sayings is hierarchies bind and blind. Because
Hmm.
to a certain degree, when you get up into a hierarchy high enough, that hierarchy holds you. And it was on Chad the Alcoholic, who you understandably might not know who he is. He wears a lucha libre mask on YouTube often, but he's now Chad the Girl Dad because his wife is pregnant. But he made a comment the other day that was very Polanyi-ish when he commented that many of the real breakthroughs that have come up in human civilization often come up cross hierarchy or cross silo, I'd say. And of course, Polanyi was one
Yeah,
of those.
integration.
And 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 I think part of that is because you tell me what you think about this. Disciplines, by virtue of how they work, especially in this culture where we have some really we have some strong controls on knowing, prevent a lot of
Hmm.
knowing in that way.
Yeah, I'd say that's epistemological. It's expertise.
Yes.
Is kind of this anal. Uh, well, I'm not going to tell you what my colleague used to describe it, but it's just kind of this anal, you're condemned to get more and more and more focused, and
Right.
you're inherently threatened by any sort of synthetic whatever.
Right.
And actually, I think the beauty, one of the many myriads of beauties of Polanyi's subsidiary focal integration is it shows, and this is the flaw in modernist epistemology, is we all presume knowledge is focal, that you focus on it. But he said no. For it to sing, you've got to put it at the subsidiary. So if you took experts, quote unquote, and put them as subsidiaries to the larger vision of whatever your university, or in your case, your corner of the internet, and that sort of a thing. If you put the people at the subsidiary and together, you can invite this transformative vision. That's how you navigate forward. And then those transformations, those integrations, it kind of in reverse catch things up as parts in a whole. Right. So for Polanyi, it's always kind of this lurching backward, break in of insight from beyond that then catches everything up in it. And that's the healing. I would use the word parachoretic dynamic of good knowing. And I argue that we all know that if we can ride a bike, if we can play football, if we can make an omelet, if we can garden, it's everywhere. You can't deny it. So I tend to start with people on bicycles and talk about that for a really long time.
Right.
Same thing. So the more superficial world evaporates by necessity, because the more fundamental is in fact just more fundamental. And you begin to occupy the more fundamental world, and then you start stitching together the pieces that need to be brought together so that it is whole. I mean, as an example for us, it was by day 4, it was sort of tacitly and maybe I guess formally agreed to that whoever had a pool in their backyard, the pool is now a commons for flush water, because you couldn't drink the pool water, but you needed to flush your toilet. And The only way to flush your toilet is you got to carry a big bucket out to the pool. And so now you've got these flotillas of people. By the way, mostly old ladies in my neighborhood, usually pulling wagons, and 4 or 5 buckets, filling them up, pulling them back. Okay, so that's a part of the functional pieces that you have to put back together. And we're putting it back together from this deeper substrate. For example, a substrate of it's now the commons. We're helping each other, and we're not relying on infrastructure that's impersonal. We're relying on personal relationships and mutual care to satisfy what are still the basic needs. And so it's like a reboot that has to go down to the bottom, and then all the basic things have to be dealt. The ones that have to be dealt with, but in this particular way. And then a world is now built from there. And it actually felt that way. I mean, by the time we were 3 weeks in, this is in some sense just reality. Here's how you eat. Here's how you poop. Here's how you get fresh water. Here's, and this is what you do. Right? And I have to imagine my daughter, who was just about to turn 6 at the time. When you go 2 solid weeks where every day is the same, except Sunday. And in her case, what that meant was after the morning is kind of over, 1 meal a day, more or less, some snacks, but you go to the church and mom and dad sort of get involved in whatever they're doing. And you participate in this whole new kind of feral youth tribe that is doing 1970s kid stuff. By the way, there's a scene, car traffic is almost gone except for big old trucks. There's a scene where I'm sitting there, I can't remember what I'm doing. I was doing I had a shovel. So I was getting ready to go shovel mud at somebody's house. And I look, and she's 5, almost 6. And she goes zipping by on like an electric motorcycle. I just look and I'm like, oh, I guess that's what's happening now. And definitely no, I don't think she even had shoes. So we're talking 70s, like we're deep, like 72. Yeah. And so that's that notion of there's actually sort of a proper order of the worlds, and that we actually live in the heartbeat of the deepest world, but we ultimately land ourselves or occupy our attention with the most superficial elements. And it's only when something happens that kicks us out of that And maybe that, yeah, that is the case. That kicks us out of that we restore ourselves back closer towards that center. Um, and maybe this is, by the way, now that I'm thinking about it, this is just coming to me real time. This is what the notion of sacraments is about. That the sacraments are these moments that are woven into the nature of reality that allow us to not, in a non-catastrophic way, achieve the day of the Lord.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I need to make sure that my people don't get bit by dogs or shot by
right,
wackos. So I'm just going to apply a rule, and that rule is going to
right.
just is coarse grained.
It's
There's
how
a
you
lot of
get it's
false
how you get
positives.
opted out of the postal service. If the postman
Yes, that's right.
believes that your dog is dangerous, suddenly you get a note from the post office that says you can come to the post office to pick up your mail. Thank you very much.
Yeah, because that it's that notion of intimacy is not part of the structure. The structure is anti-intimate, and everything that is necessarily served by intimacy is therefore completely not served by this kind of a institution, and everything that is best served by intimacy is necessarily poorly served by this kind of institution. Okay, so then what happens is we're entering into a moment, and I experienced this first person. Like we might say that a big part of the transition of this world was moving into the reality that relationships and intimacy are capable of meeting human needs in a particularly profound way. And I mean, I'll just give a simple example. By day 4, people are like, we don't have any food. And by the way, in most cases now, we're also troubled by the fact you can't wash your dishes, which means you're piling up dirty dishes. And
Right.
post-hurricane, it's all humid and it's all nasty. It's like, this is no good. What are we going to do?
Right.
So the natural answer, all right, we're all going to congregate. Let's all go to one place and we'll have family dinner together. And that's just what you do. And then 5 or 6 people, you're getting water out of the pool. Some people are filtering it, boiling it for washing dishes. Other people are beginning to cook food, and that serves 40 or 50 people, which now becomes a completely different sensibility. You begin to realize the why breaking bread together in large groups makes a lot of sense. And that was about 4 or 5 days where we did that, because that's just the context that we had before the food truck showed up and church became the place that we did that. So let's see. Yeah. So part of what we're exiting is the superficial reality where we had given up the sacred, given up the commons, given up the domain, where relationalities of the nature and of the essence, into the world of the market and the world of the state, which have capabilities. There's things that they can do, but they are impersonal in nature and anti-intimate in nature. And both of those modes are failing in an accelerating fashion. And one of the biggest opportunities, and again, I say like by necessity, is that we have found a way to, how do you say it? We're either going to enter into the day of the Lord the easy way or the hard way. Let's put it that way. And do so. To enter in the easy way would be a really great idea.
Yeah.
And then let's rest in the fact that the meaning crisis is resolved in the domain of intimacy, in the domain of relationship. And that's something that we need. And if we desperately, like we know we need, we're sort of desiccated. We don't quite understand what it is that we are missing. But we yearn for something that we can't quite put our finger on. But when we begin to experience it, we're like, oh, yes, more of that. And we begin to realize that there's a tremendous, actually, wow. I'm going to make a little bit of a shift, but this landed on me heavily over the last week. Oh, that's right. Because I actually wrote it to Peugeot. The notion of, in our current moment, we live in a very subtle time. We might say spiritualized time. I'm not quite sure which one is a better way of thinking about it. But the example here is something like Hiroshima and the Holocaust. So the previous moment was a moment of non-subtle, hyper non-subtle, intense, objective, loud, noisy, and acute. Right? The Hiroshima lasted for seconds, minutes. The aftermath of cancer lasted for longer, but the intensity of the event was very, very narrow. What we've done is we basically have turned that on the side, and we are now living through a truly chronic and deeply subtle apocalypse. And so just take, for example, the notion of what happens to the light, to the meaningfulness of life when people are oriented, the classic example, a family has gone out to dinner and they're not talking to each other, they're on their phones. Very subtle, very, very difficult to grasp the horror of what's happening there. But then if you were able to imagine being on your deathbed and noticing that you actually only spent 6 minutes with the people you loved most, everything else was spent in this extremely superficial trap, actually, then it will land on you potently that your life was basically taken away.
Yes.
You actually were killed. You were taken into the gas chamber and you were executed, but slowly, very, very, very slowly.
And
it's a level more
pleasantly.
of the soul.
Yeah. And,
Yes,
and
well,
you're doing it yourself.
yes, you're made perfectly complicit
Yes.
in this horror, right? And that, which is even more insidious. So maybe the word insidious is the best way of putting it. It's subtle, but most fundamentally, it's insidious. And this is a really interesting challenge because, well, it takes a potent courage to charge the machine gun nests in the realm of the loud and of the coarse-grained and of the acute. It takes a different kind of courage to be able to respond to the reality of the insidious. And so that's part of our revelation. And the part of the revelation is, in our case, what happened was all of the distractions just got turned off.
Yep.
We couldn't participate in any of that, and we were forced to interact with other people.
Yep.
And okay, interesting. And as it turns out, there was something beautiful about that people are now remembering.
Yep.
But the deeper point, this is what I was trying to say, it's either the easy way or the hard way. As the insidious collapses ultimately, and ultimately, whether it collapses because human beings are no longer able to muster the capacity to produce children, and the species just collapses because there's just not enough people to maintain it, or fill in the blank, right? People actually, something deep inside the darkest elements of the soul revolts so profoundly at the insidious murder that it bursts through and starts, exploding things on the outside. Fill in the blank. There's many different ways it might play out, but the insidious ultimately does collapse.
Yeah.
And that's another thing, right? That's another thing we're facing. And in some sense, we saw that in the context of 2024.
Yep.
Part of what unfolded was a deep, and in many cases, deeply unconscious rejection of nihilism, rejection of death, a rejection of the slow evaporation of meaning.
Oh boy, so many ways I want to take this. It's interesting how the day of the Lord is also an exorcism. And again, I think of the baptism of the Haitians, that their baptism is an exorcism. And what happens with the baptism of the hurricane upon your communities is certain spirits are at least temporarily exorcised from all of you. And it's an involuntary exorcism. It's interesting how the world around it sees it as a tragedy, sees it as a catastrophe. But again, it has that dual nature of exorcism is always a death and a rebirth.
Mm-hmm.
Something, and I love how you just framed the insidious. And I wonder now, when I sent you that note, I said, once you sort of get your head out of this, I'm curious now about any sense of nostalgia now that the superficial has reemerged. Now, because this will change you. You won't in some ways participate in the insidious guilt-free anymore because you've been touched by another world.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if I used to have, so I lived there's about 7 years that a significantly bipolar, rapid cycling Mormon alcoholic lived against the door of my office. And during those years, I was homeschooling in the morning. And so I shifted all of my work hours to late afternoon and evening. So I would be in my office every night, and that homeless man would sleep literally against my door, physically against my door. Later, we had 40 foot of building he could have slept next to. And so I stopped him one day. I said, Daniel, you're always camped against my door. And he looks at me and says, that's so when you come to work, you can see me and we can talk. And I thought, of course it is.
Mhm.
And so I would I would sit in my office, and this was, of course, before YouTube or anything else. And I'm just a small church pastor in a dying church, annoying my neighbors because of my seeming inability to resolve the homeless thing that is a mess just one door from them, which is super
Mm.
annoying. And he would just lean against that door, and depending on where he was in his cycle, he would just, I hate my life. I hate my life. He just, cuss, cuss. I hate my life. I want to die. I want to die. I want to die. And I'd sit here writing my sermons, listening to him articulate his inner monologue. And then it would be winter, and winter in Sacramento is not a brutal thing by any means. It's not Michigan or Minnesota, but it's cold and it's blowy and it's rainy. It's not freezing, but it can get into the 30s at night. And it was funny because when I was home, warm in bed, with my wife and my children, with a heater on, with locked doors, I had a sense of, and I never understood why I felt this, but I had a sense of, it wasn't quite nostalgia, but it felt like it. Um, it wasn't envy, but it was, I could sense something in his everyday apocalypse that something in me yearned to participate in, but couldn't because I'm the father of a family. And so in that sense, I need to, maintain the doors and keep the family fed and keep the children warm. But there was another part of me, and I think it was tied to the meaning crisis, which, like, sort of in The Walking Dead, I remember at one point in the series, they all begin to realize that all of the survivors are infected with the zombie virus. And the truth is that it doesn't take a zombie bite to turn. All they need to do is die and they will turn. And so suddenly the whole crew now has to, right before people get to or at the moment of death, they have to, they have to do the kill shot to keep their loved ones from becoming a monster. And so I'm curious about what's happening in terms of you emotionally now that the superficial has reemerged and the water is back on and the lights are back on and the internet is back on. And now when you go to church, I imagine there's a layer that things are different because
Mhm.
you've now shared something with these people, and that will never be taken away from you. You will always have a degree of intimacy and memory of moments of intimacy that will go with you for as long as each of you shall live. But I'm curious about if you're having any experience of this, of nostalgia or longing or lament for the day of the Lord and the crisis.
Well, yes, certainly. Um, and even I even recognized that as the life got easier, there was always a bittersweetness. It's actually not that different from being a parent, actually.
Yeah. Yes,
Right?
yes, yes.
um, when the internet came back on, it was useful to be able to communicate with my mom and my daughters and let them know that I was alive.
Yeah.
And there was a feeling of shit, now I'm going to be doing this thing again.
Yes.
Ah. Um, so that's real. What I think is maybe the most particular, I was noticing like in my mind, like this turning sideways. So Walking Dead is nice because the kill shot, again, it's kind of like it converts our insidious back into the acute. It's like it's like this, but it's this way, not this way. So what does it look like? Well, one of the things it looks like is there was a field of intimacy that came out during the crisis. And then by this, I mean literally the human beings who I began to cultivate relationships with because we were helping each other, which is now no longer present. It's like a constriction of a vascular system. So the smallest capillaries are no longer active, and so those nutrients are no longer reaching that part of the body. I mean, there are people that I was working side by side every day that I haven't seen. in 2 weeks. There are people that I was serving, people I was bringing food, water, shelter to that I haven't seen. And so on the one hand, as life has become easy again, and pleasant, I can go to a restaurant, I can get food. It's nice. 2 days ago, we can actually, or I guess today, I can actually drink with a glass at the restaurant, which was, that's nice. Ice, all these are nice. And also a feeling of, how do you say, like the most marginal, like the relationships that are not as close to the center. They're no longer, in my case, captured by my family, my direct physical neighbors, house church and church, right? Those are the heartbeats that everybody within that sphere is still, it's tight, like it's rich. But there's now people who were within that sphere that are no longer within that sphere. And that will continue. Now, interestingly enough, we have Thanksgiving coming up.
Yes.
And we're going to be hosting thousands of meals in the park. It actually was a beautiful kind of secular sacred combo.
Yeah.
There's a Catholic church on this side, there's our church on this side, and then there's a park and a library in the middle, more or less. Like there's not quite exactly adjacent, but within like a 2-minute walk of the place where our church happens to be. And so there was people operating in the secular domain doing good work during the crisis at the park. And then the two churches were doing their thing. And of course, was lots of cross-fertilization.
Yep.
And so I discovered at house church last night that we're bringing the band back together.
Yeah.
There's something like literally 500 turkeys that are being brought in, and just getting a massive Thanksgiving feast in this park for everybody, right? Because there's still a lot of everybody who's not in the position to be able to have a thing. And so this is like a way of bringing these relationships back. I'm going to be reaching out to a bunch of people. In some cases, I may have to actually drive out and walk up because they're probably still off the grid. My world got easier, not everybody's did. And say, hey, do you have plans for Thanksgiving? Or do you have a place to be where you can be in communion with other people? Sorry, it's fine. I just remembered that my neighbor was decorating for Christmas. I was like, what are you doing decorating for Christmas before Thanksgiving? She said, well, the thing I'm most thankful for is Jesus. So it made all the sense in the world to me. I go, yeah, okay. Good answer. Put on this Frank Sinatra. Give me some eggnog. But that notion of the real sadness, and by the way, this is a real sadness that I have in general because I'm really terrible at maintaining relationships. So the real sadness of the relationships of care that were outside of that particular sphere that are fading and likely, in fact, just will fade.
Yeah.
That's just the way it is.
Yeah.